Hi, and welcome to the channel Mask of Science. My purpose is to expose the theory of evolution for what it is. A baseless, outdated theory that's not supported by science, but by philosophical opinions. Now, even if you don't have a scientific background, you can understand with certainty that evolution's false. It's mathematically impossible. It's riddled with numerous scientific fallacies, and its claims are justified primarily by scientific fraud. Now, in this short presentation, I'm going to outline several reasons why evolution is not a legitimate scientific theory. The most fundamental reason is because evolution is founded on the assumption of atheism. In other words, there's a pre-drawn conclusion that the origin and diversification of every biologic system can be explained entirely in terms of atheistic evolution, without intelligent design. Now, the talking point you're likely to hear is that God cannot be evaluated through science. Therefore, we must restrict all our inquiry to naturalistic causes. If this is true, then evolution can't be scientifically evaluated either. You can't claim to be practicing science when you search only to validate one hypothesis and then arbitrarily exclude the only competing hypothesis as impossible or unscientific. Another reason evolution doesn't reach the threshold of a legitimate scientific theory is because there is no scientific evidence to support it. Evolution is defended primarily by philosophy-based arguments and anecdotes. So with atheism as a starting point, it's widely stated that evolution is supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. Now, virtually every argument that you're going to hear is a variation of one of these themes. And none of these arguments are scientific. The first five, homology, imperfections of nature, continuity of life, embryology, and vestigial structures, these are all founded on philosophical opinions. And the arguments of biogeography and fossil record are based on selective interpretation of data and are therefore not scientific. And finally, the alleged observation of evolution is founded on an incorrect definition of the word evolution. Let's look at homology. Homology simply refers to the similarities between species, such as the grasping hand of a human and the flipper of a dolphin. They're homologous because the bones of a dolphin's flipper are very similar in design to the bones of a human hand. This is the most widely presented type of argument for evolution. However, it's not scientific evidence. It's only a philosophical opinion. Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, defended evolutionary theory by arguing that an intelligent designer would not have created different animals with similar bone structures. Notice here he says, an engineer starting from scratch could design better limbs in each case. This is not a scientific argument. This is a philosophy-based hunch. What this really amounts to is a philosophical mockery of intelligent creation. In essence, it's argued that homology is inconsistent with intelligent design. Therefore, we should accept evolution by default. If homology was presented as a scientific argument, it should be demonstrated that the genetic code directing the creation of a human hand and a dolphin's flipper are sufficiently similar that they could be explained by a model of common descent through mutations. Evolution completely fails in this regard. In fact, it's of interest to note that although a human hand and a dolphin's flipper have homologous skeletal structures, the DNA that produces these two forms is not homologous. So the argument of homology is flawed on two counts. First, it's a philosophical argument. And second, when this hypothesis is tested in most biologic systems, it fails. Now, it's commonly stated that DNA homology or molecular homology offers absolute proof of evolution. For example, humans and chimpanzees share many similarities in their DNA, hence descent from a common ancestor. So how does the comparing of DNA sequences of different species and then contriving an imaginary line of descent prove evolution? Again, this is a philosophy-based hypothesis. Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists today, was recently asked what he considered to be the most compelling evidence for evolution. His response, DNA homology.
I think perhaps the single most convincing fact, observation that you could point to would be the pattern of resemblances that you see when you compare the genes using modern DNA techniques, actually looking at the letter-to-letter correspondences between genes. Compare the genes of any pair of animals you like, pair of animals, pair of plants, and then plot out the resemblances, and they fall in a perfect hierarchy, a perfect family tree. And the only alternative to it being a family tree is that the intelligent designer deliberately set out to deceive us in the most underhand and devious manner.
This is the way, essentially, all evidence for evolution is ultimately defended, by the attempted disproof of God. In this case, Dawkins is given 30 seconds on national television to prove to the world that evolution is true, and he can't make a case without bringing up his religious beliefs. So remember, anytime you hear the argument that DNA proves evolution, including such things as molecular parahomology, atavisms, ERVs, transposons, pseudogenes, know that these are all ultimately based on religious beliefs regarding the presumed nature of an intelligent designer. So beginning with Darwin, virtually all arguments for evolution boil down to arguments against intelligent design. A model of evolution is presented and compared with a model of intelligent design. It's argued that evolution should be accepted not because it can be validated through experimentation or mathematical demonstration, but because it is simply deemed more plausible than a model of intelligent design. This approach is not scientific, because a model of intelligent design cannot be determined without making religious assumptions. And by the way, those religious assumptions are generally made from a perspective of atheism. Another evidence presented for evolution is the geographic distribution of species. This line of evidence is based on philosophy and selective evidence. For example, it's argued that the absence of indigenous land mammals and amphibians in the Hawaiian Islands is evidence of the absence of an intelligent creator. It's claimed that an intelligent designer should have placed amphibians and mammals in Hawaii, since this seems to be such an ideal habitat. Again, this is just a philosophical opinion. And as with all arguments for evolution, selective evidence is presented. Yes, the lack of amphibians and mammals on remote volcanic islands does appear consistent with an evolutionary model. But the presence of monk seals in Hawaii is not consistent with an evolutionary model. Based on DNA analysis, the closest relatives of the Hawaiian monk seal live in the Caribbean and Mediterranean seas. So a model of evolution would require the Hawaiian monk seal, which is a warm water species, to have migrated around the tip of South America through frigid waters and across thousands of miles of open ocean, by accident. This is a physical impossibility given the fact that monk seals can't survive in the open ocean. Another line of evidence presented for evolution is the fossil record. It's stated that transitional species are found in the fossil record, thus proving evolution. Now, this foundational argument for evolution is based on selective evidence, and the findings are greatly overstated. And the only evidence that is presented is evidence that appears to be consistent with evolution. Evidence that is not consistent with evolution is swept under the rug. For example, in all 4 lineages that supposedly develop powered flight, birds, insects, mammals, and reptiles, no transitional species have been identified in thousands of specimens spanning supposed evolutionary timeframes of hundreds of millions of years. So if evolution were true, numerous transitional species which would be imperfect in their ability to fly would be expected to be found in the fossil record, and they're absent. And there's no explanation for this. No one can objectively look at the fossil record and say, this proclaims evolution. The fossil record is selectively looked at to justify a pre-held belief in evolution. Stephen Jay Gould admitted that the lack of transitional species in the fossil record is almost never studied explicitly because prevailing theory treated stasis as uninteresting, non-evidence for evolution. Now, I should point out that Stephen Jay Gould was perhaps the most respected paleontologist of the modern era, And what he is saying here is an open admission of scientific fraud. You can't claim to be practicing science when you have a pre-drawn conclusion and only look for data to validate that conclusion. And that's what most paleontologists do. They look for missing links, but they ignore or gloss over the observation that most species are unchanged over supposed eons of time. So the fossil record does not show the pattern of gradualism that would be predicted by evolutionary theory. What you have is a collection of anecdotes. And this practice completely disqualifies evolutionary paleontology as scientific. Another line of evidence presented is embryology or prenatal development. This is not scientific evidence. This is philosophy based in the attempt to disprove intelligent design. For example, Raymond Satera argued that the presence of embryonic hind limb buds in fetal whales is proof that they weren't intelligently designed. This is a philosophical opinion only. In short, it cannot be demonstrated how a cow or other land-dwelling mammal could have evolved into a whale. Philosophical arguments and special pleading references to the fossil record form the foundation of the evidence. Another argument is that evolution is observable. This is claimed because the word evolution is incorrectly defined. The breeding of dogs is not evolution. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria is not evolution. None of the examples of observable evolution that are given constitute a fundamental change or increase in genetic information. So in short, if you analyze the evidences commonly presented for evolution, it's easy to recognize that these are not scientific evidences. It's not legitimate science because first and foremost, it presumes the absence of a designing intelligence. And second, that assumption is justified by philosophical opinions. Evidences such as biogeography in the fossil record involve the selective filtering of evidence, and this is therefore not scientific. The claim that evolution is observable can only be made by misrepresenting what evolution is, a fundamental genetic change resulting in speciation. Thanks for tuning in.